Thank you. Arthur James Balfour, the last grandee, as one of his biographers called him, certainly cuts a rather interesting figure among British politicians. Although as Prime Minister from 1902 to 1905, he secured the Entente Cordiale with France, his greatest claim to fame remains the letter he sent to Lord Rothschild on behalf of the British government on the 2nd of November 1917, supporting the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. Lord Balfour's personality was a particularly complex one. Side by side with the gifted conservative politician, there was the intellectual whose curiosity seems to have had few equivalents among British prime ministers. This complexity did not bring him only intellectual respect. A persistent image sees him as dilettante, touching a number of ideas and topics without seriously engaging in them and in their implications. Such a judgment seems to be confirmed by his famous obiter dictum, nothing matters very much and few things matter at all. The following pages will propose to test this judgment through a review of some of Balfour's most important writings. Throughout his life, and side by side with his political career, Balfour published extensively on a large number of topics, from the philosophy of history, literature, on Jane Austen, Sir Walter Scott and Robert Louis Stevenson, music, Handel, and painting, the pre-Raphaelites. To the supernatural, he was among the first members of the Society for Psychical Research, eventually becoming its president. In many ways, he was what one would call today a public intellectual, expressing himself, orally and in writing, on a vast array of issues. I shall seek here to focus on Balfour's religious and intellectual world, asking myself whether a link can be seen, and if so, which one, between his own world and the pronouncement of the famous declaration bearing his name. Was Balfour, when writing this letter, acting solely as a British politician in the interest of his country, or was he also, or mainly, inspired by his own beliefs about the Jews and their role in history? Before we do so, however, a brief description is in order of some religious and intellectual trends in Britain dealing with the return of the Jews to their land and bearing upon the formation of Balfour's spiritual and intellectual world. The politician and social reformist Lord Ashley, 1801-1885, who became the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury after his father's death, was a leading figure of 19th century evangelical Anglicanism. A president of the British and Foreign Bible Society from 1851 to his death, he was also a strong supporter of the movement for the restoration of the Jews to their land, which would be the prelude to Christ's second coming. Shaftesbury was also the president of the Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews. Who will be the Cyrus of modern times, the second chosen to restore the God's people, he wrote in his diary already in 1826. It is to him that we owe the famous or infamous phrase of a country without a nation to a nation without a country, a phrase he penned in 1843 and which would be picked up much later in 1901 by Israel Zangwill. Together with Palmerston, Shaftesbury insisted on the congruence between Christian restorationism and British imperial strategy. Palestine was a major gateway to India and the East, and giving British protection to the Jews in the Holy Land, that is to say, liberating it in some way from the hands of the Ottoman Turks, could fit nicely with British imperial strategy. Such a policy was summarized by the Christian Herald in its issue of 26th of April 1877 in the following terms. I quote, "The solution to the Eastern question, whenever it comes, will be the overthrow of Turkey. The overthrow of Turkey will be the liberation of Judea. The liberation of Judea will mean its colonization by its own people, and the restoration of the Jews will mean the imminent nearness of the second advent of Christ," end quote. And yet, as noted by Eitan Bar Yosef in his excellent The Holy Land in English Culture, 1799-1917, while evangelicalism became part and parcel of Victorian culture, Christian Zionism did not. Christian Zionist ideas stayed in constant circulation throughout the 19th century, but always remained marginal to mainstream Christian culture and life. Daniel Deronda, George Eliot's Zionist, quote-unquote, novel, set in Cambridge more or less when Balfour was a student there, was the last one she published in 1876. Eliot had written her book, she said, in order to ennoble Judaism and to pay a moral debt to the long-suffering Jews who must be treated with sympathy, as she wrote in a letter to Harriet Beecher Stowe, adding, I quote again, "Moreover, not only towards the Jews, but towards all Oriental peoples with whom we English come in contact, a spirit of arrogance and contemptuous dictatorialness is observable, which has become a national disgrace to us." End quote. This sentence reveals that for Eliot, the Jews were an Oriental people whose return to their country of old in the East needed to be encouraged. It also reflects Eliot's repulsion from common British imperialist attitudes. For her, the return of the Jews to Zion formed part of a broader movement towards more justice and humanity in the relationship between European and Eastern peoples. What should also be emphasized here is that Eliot remained far away from Christian Zionism and Restorationism. For her, Zionism was not part of the divine economy of salvation, but a chapter in the liberation of the East from Western colonialism. For her, one might say, Zionism was a humanism. David Lloyd George, 1863-1945, like Balfour, one of the most striking British politicians in the 20th century, was Prime Minister during the First World War when Balfour, his Minister of Foreign Affairs, sent his famous letter to Lord Rothschild. Lloyd George and Balfour were endowed with vastly different personalities and had little in common beyond their loyalty to the Zionist cause. This loyalty may have stemmed from their early education by devout evangelical mothers who transmitted to their respective sons the idea of the Jews as a special people and the idea of restoring them to their ancient land. Lloyd George, unlike Balfour, soon lost the faith of his youth, but the impact of his religious education never left him. To a Jewish audience after the war, Lloyd George explained that as a child he knew the names of the kings of Israel, but not those of the kings of England. Palestine and the history of the Hebrews remained part and parcel of his culture. For him, the Jews were, together with the ancient Greeks, the most impressive people in history. Cultural Christianity, for Lloyd George, entailed sympathy and support for Zionism. Mutatis mutandis, the same was true for Balfour. In 1867, Matthew Arnold published his Culture and Anarchy. Chapter 4, Hebraism and Hellenism, would soon become a seminal text in British letters. Arnold insisted there on the Hebraic origins of English literature. According to him, the English were, in a sense, Hebrews. For Arnold, the final aim of both Hellenism and Hebraism, and this was true of all great spiritual disciplines, was man's final perfection or salvation. Together, all these various aspects represent what can be called the Jewish dimension of 19th century British culture, a subject still waiting for a proper exploration, a form of background of Balfour's early biography. We are lucky that Balfour himself went to great pains in describing himself and the impact on him from different religious and intellectual trends. His detailed autobiographical writings, in particular, remain a rich source of documentation. Unlike Lloyd George, Balfour never rebelled against religion. But the kind of Christianity he grew up with was quite different from that of his evangelical mother. Balfour was born and grew up, the third of 8 children, at Whittingham House in Scotland, in a very affluent and extremely well-connected family. His maternal uncle, Lord Salisbury, would be his direct predecessor as Prime Minister. In this milieu, Christianity constituted an important part of identity. And there were at home Sunday evening prayers. Balfour remained later in life a communicant in both the churches of Scotland and England, although he does not seem to have been a very intense Christian. Balfour's Christianity has thus been described as practical, religion offering to human beings an ethical framework that could protect them from anarchy and barbarism, and should therefore be supported by the state. By practical, one should understand as little metaphysics and soteriology as possible, an attitude for which religion is almost tantamount to cultural tradition. His views about religion and the need to protect established religion seems to have been rather akin to those of his uncle, Lord Salisbury, who thought that civilization was doomed without Christianity. Already in his youth, while a pupil at Eton, where he studied under an influential master, William Johnson Corey, Balfour found himself much attracted by philosophy and also, as he tells us, by, quote unquote, the conflict between science and religion. At the University of Cambridge, he read moral sciences. In Cambridge, he soon developed a close friendship with Henry Sidgwick, 1838-1900, which would last until Sidgwick's death. With 2 other friends, Frederick Myers, who coined the word telepathy, and another friend, they would meet on Sunday afternoons in Balfour's rooms at Trinity College. Balfour also joined the Cambridge Apostles, this secretive group of students, which still lasts, I think. Sidgwick, who was 10 years Balfour's senior, would eventually marry his sister Eleanor Mildred and would become, in Cambridge, professor of moral philosophy from 1883 to his death. Sidgwick, at once a classicist, a political economist, and a philosopher, cut a formidable intellectual figure. His serious reserves about the Church of England brought him to give up a fellowship when he felt he could not in good conscience claim to belong to the Church. He was, in 1881, among the founders of the Society for Psychical Research, of which he would later become the president. The society investigating phenomena related to hypnotism, mediumship, apparitions, and haunting houses, as well as seances. Sidgwick drew Balfour into the society, of which Balfour, too, would become president in 1894. Throughout his life, Balfour conducted his intellectual work side by side with his political career. In 1874, he was elected to the parliament as a conservative, while his first book, A Defense of Philosophic Doubt, was published in 1879. The core of Balfour's lifelong intellectual pursuit, the struggle between science and religion in the post-Darwinian intellectual world, appears very early on, at the time of his studies in Cambridge. He was certainly encouraged by his early desire to devote his life to philosophical study, by his knowledge that he did not have to think about earning a living owing to the family's affluence. In the preface to A Defense of Philosophic Doubt, Balfour already thanks Henry Sidgwick. Although the book, published as he was 31, got a reasonably positive reception as the first book of a young man, it did not sell very much. In a letter to his niece, Blanche Dugdale, written in 1920, he says about this book, "I took Defense of Philosophic Doubt very seriously. I thought I was making a contribution to the religious thought of an original kind, and whatever may be its merits, it was the solid background of 20 years of my life. In my youth, it was my great safeguard against the feeling of frivolity. This is much more important now, biographically, than the book itself," end quote. From this letter, then it appears that for the young Balfour, demonstrating that the ground upon which religious beliefs are established was as solid as that of underpinning science. Without them, he wrote, life would have been meaningless for him. Nothing but a cosmic joke. The main point of the book was to argue that there was no real contradiction or discrepancy in his terms between science and religion, and that theologians and freethinkers, as he calls them, should realize that this discrepancy was only superficial and ought to be overcome. The mode of thought and the pattern of argumentation apparent in A Defense of Philosophic Doubt would remain typical of him, reappearing in his later writings. This mode was mainly dialectical and argumentative, reflecting as much interest in the ideas it opposes as in those it supports. If one must encapsulate Balfour's subject, it is the struggle between science and religion in the post-Darwinian intellectual world. I must confess to finding Balfour's works rather repetitive and rebarbative. It is quite difficult for us today to imagine the intensity of the feelings aroused then by Darwin's theory, in Britain as elsewhere. But then, it is also true that such battles of words between supporters of science and those of religion would seem to retain in Britain to this day a character and an intensity not found elsewhere in Europe. In his first book, Balfour had no intention of developing a destructive criticism of science. He was arguing, rather, against those optimistic positivists and their hero, Auguste Comte, that scientific progress should not lead us to believe that religion was now something of the past. For him, science should not deny religion, nor should religion reject science. Both should learn to live in peaceful harmony as they cater for different needs of humankind. Closer at home than Comte, however, was the agnosticism of Herbert Spencer, 1820-1903, and his attempt to turn metaphysics into an evolutionary science that was the immediate aim of his arrows and that raised the ire of many a good Anglican theologian. Spencer's attitude Balfour called naturalism. It reflected positivism, agnosticism, materialism. To those he opposed spiritualism. For him, positivism was inferior to Christianity as a moralizing agent, as he argues in The Religion of Humanity, a text published in 1888. T.H. Huxley, the father of agnosticism, strongly criticized Balfour's ideas, arguing that Balfour confounds agnosticism and naturalism. Nonetheless, it seems that Balfour's arguments against naturalism made a strong impression on the British public. He claimed to be a religious man precisely because he believed in reason and knew its limits. Like religion, reason draws for him the most important premises from authority. It is authority, too, that makes ethics and politics possible. 16 years later, in 1895, Balfour published The Foundations of Belief, being notes introductory to the study of theology. In this book, his argument is double-edged, both against the naturalists who reject religion altogether and against those theologians for whom any scientific discovery, any new biblical study using higher criticism becomes a new source of worry, a trigger for an attempt at refutation. Balfour rejects both those attitudes, arguing that science needs theism in order to be tenable. By theism, Balfour means the belief in the existence of God, the rational author of the world, and warrant of science. To the false conflict of science and religion, Balfour adds the problem of evil, solved only when we know that the Creator God is also a good God. He insists that his argument is not that there is no ethics without a theistic assumption, but rather that an indifferent or evil God would destroy morality. Similarly, it is important to understand that evolution does not strengthen the evidence for theism. In his own words, rather, assuming God's existence, evolution harmonizes with morality. Balfour concludes that no unification of belief can take place on a purely scientific basis, and that religious, ethical, and scientific truths are interdependent. Such a unified vision of experience may remind one of aspects of Henri Bergson's philosophy. Bergson was in the first decades of the 20th century, even before his 1927 Nobel Prize, one of the most famous thinkers in Europe. It is significant that Balfour read Bergson's L'Évolution créatrice and held a long meeting with him during the latter's visit to England in 1911. From what we have seen so far, it appears that Balfour's conception of Christianity is very pale indeed. According to it, the idea of a good God is much more present than that of his Son, Jesus Christ, who died for our sins. Actually, the impression that Jesus Christ is almost absent from Balfour's writings is confirmed by a mere perusal of his two other books on religion, both representing the texts of his two sets of Gifford lectures at the University of Glasgow. The first series read in 1914 and the second in 1922-23. Theism and Humanism, the first volume, returns to ideas the author had expressed in his first two books. Let us quote here from the 10th and final lecture, which embodies the whole volume's summary and conclusion. In its criticism of common knowledge, that ultimately brings up to theism. Balfour's former foes, the agnostic empiricists, remain the enemies he argues against. I quote, "I have no sympathy with the singular combination of intellectual arrogance and intellectual timidity of this school of thought. The lecture's conclusion is curiously trivial in its simplicity," writes Balfour. Narrow theism, simplistic religion using the language of Sunday school, does not have the courage to explore the unknowable, that is to say, science. It is a great illusion to search for proofs of God's existence, as men search for evidence about the ghosts or witches. Finally, the same conclusion that we already heard is repeated once more. God is not so much an entity as the condition for scientific knowledge. Theism and Thought, a study in familiar beliefs, contains the second series of his Gifford lectures. Balfour notes at the onset that despite the war which has occurred between the two sets of lectures, their object remains the same. On what theory of the universe the highest values of ethics, aesthetics, and knowledge, the good, the beautiful, and the true, could be most effectively maintained? For him, the conflict between theology and science should be seen, rather than a collusion of doctrine, a rivalry of appeal, rejecting, as he had done previously, Kant's proofs of the existence of God. He insists that our beliefs may be regarded as the outcome of two quite different processes or kinds of processes, the causal and the rational. The first moves from antecedent to consequent, while the second moves from a premise to a conclusion, A collision, he adds, is bound to occur between these two processes. At the start of the lectures, Balfour, naming the theory of natural selection, I quote, one of the greatest triumphs of the 19th century, insists that, I quote again, great things are ultimately the work of unreason, and calls to an understanding of the spiritual side of evolution. In numerous essays and articles, Balfour continued for many years to express his ideas on religion and philosophy, although my impression is that these ideas did not undergo any major changes. In a text from 1906, he expresses his hope that Christianity will eventually become the world religion, that is to say, that all nations will convert to Christianity. Before this can happen, he adds, Christianity will have to argue convincingly against some great civilizations, traditions, and philosophies. In order to do so successfully, it will have to present itself as a rational religion, as a religion open to contemporary science. Indeed, he adds, the last generations have seen in the various churches a peaceable revolution, and that Christendom has absorbed all the results of science, of criticism, of investigation in every field of thought. In an essay entitled The Other Arthur Balfour, Protector of the Jews, Brian Klug from Oxford has sought to interpret the paradox of a man who showed on various occasions, both before and after his famous letter from 1917, that he was imbued of philosemitic feelings while he passed in 1905 a bill that strictly limited immigration to the United Kingdom. For all practical purposes, this bill would mainly prevent suffering Jews from Eastern Europe from finding a haven in Britain. Klug, who points out that there were also raisons d'etat that supported the decision to promulgate the declaration, reckons that those cannot be counted as its main cause. According to him, it is Balfour's idea of nationhood that lies at the bottom of the declaration. The young Balfour, he reminds us, had been first educated by his evangelical mother, who transmitted to her son the idea that the Jews were a special people, as well as the ideal of restoring them to their ancient land. While this stands to reason, it is not clear to me that this claim can be established on extant sources. For Balfour, in any case, the Jews were, I quote, the most gifted race that mankind has seen since the Greeks of the 5th century. In 1918, in a letter to his sister, he writes, "The Jews are too great a race not to count, and they ought to have a place where those who had strong racial idealism could develop their lines as a nation and govern themselves." End quote. As such, they remained a people apart, who would always remain aliens and could not easily become British. Hence, his support of a bill strongly limiting their immigration. Klug may well be right in his explanation of the apparent contradiction between the 1905 Aliens Act and the 1917 Declaration, but he does not explain adequately enough Balfour's tradition of philosemitism as expressed in the Declaration, a tradition recently analyzed anew by Gertrude Himmelfarb. It is clear that in his old age, Balfour came to see his role as protector of the Jews with much pride. In his introduction to Nahum Sokolov's History of Zionism, 1919, he writes that all men of goodwill should support Zionism. Indeed, it has a double value. Parallel to its obvious value for the Jews, it is also of great value to humankind and will do a great spiritual work. Balfour seems here to rejoin George Eliot's arguments for her support of Zionism. Namely, Zionism is essentially a humanistic movement, and humankind at large will benefit from the return of the Jews to their land. If this is the case, the roots of Balfour's letter to Lord Rothschild are to be found neither in raison d'etat nor in his religious feelings. Raison d'etat may well have helped, only in subsidiary fashion. Even our brief survey of Balfour's main writings reveals that his argument for religion reflects a stance closer to deism than to any kind of Christian theology. His vision of a conversion of the whole humankind to Christianity in the future is predicated on a transformation of the latter into some kind of deism, science-friendly and strong in humanistic values, but quite weak on doctrine. One should note at this point that there seems to be no substantive reference at all to Jews, their identity and their future in any of Balfour's major writings. Similarly, even if allowing the lasting impact of his mother's putative early education on his image of the Jews and on his later attitude towards them, it is clear that he was not drawn to redact his letter by anything resembling 19th century restorationist theology. It is hard, then, to argue that Balfour's philosemitism, as it is expressed in the 1917 Declaration, finds its roots in either his religious or philosophical tenets. What, then, was the precise nature of his Judeophilia? This riddle can be answered only if we take all the variant trends extant in Victorian Britain together. The formation of his mind and the crystallization of his feelings were formed by them all, and it is their joint impact that brought him to conceive and formulate his declaration. Balfour's attitude to the Jews essentially reflects, then, an essentially humanist vision. It was heightened by the Jews' significance for a Christian nation that could be considered, in the words of Matthew Arnold, to be the new Hebrews, beyond the obvious Christian identity as Verus Israel, something with no equivalent among other European peoples. In 1927, I'm concluding, Balfour stated, "It is quite true that I'm one of the oldest British Zionists." While in 1930, shortly before his death, he told his niece that what he had done for the Jews was the most worth of his doing. In 1948, Churchill started a campaign to recognize Israel, saying, "I am, of course, a Zionist." Like Churchill's Zionism, that of Balfour had little to do with his religion or his philosophy and reflected rather a more immediate instinct. Religious deism and philosophical skepticism were for him the ingredients of a reasonable approach to politics as they were to science. Even if his God was not really the God of Israel anymore, the decisive role of Israel in history remained, and together with the Jews' present suffering, amply justified their return to their land. Just as he saw no contradiction between science and religion, when perceived in the right manner, he saw no contradiction between his support of Zionism and protecting the legitimate rights of the Arab population of Palestine. For him, both were expressions of his essentially humanistic approach. Thank you very much.